In 1946, the other transformation which took place in Asia was in a region then known as French Indochina. This area encompasses the modern countries of Cambodia, Vietnam and Laos. During the Second World War, the region was run by the Vichy French government until it was overrun by the invading Japanese. However, this wasn't the end of the resistance, as Ho Chi Minh began an organised communist resistance in Vietnam called the Viet Minh, and was supported by the neighbouring Republican Chinese to the north. Because of their opposition to the Japanese, they also received funding from the Russians and from the Americans. But the end of the war saw the northern part of Indochina briefly occupied by the Republican Chinese under Chiang Kai-shek, and briefly also the southern part was occupied by the British forces under Mountbatten. It was agreed that the Japanese forces north of the 16th parallel would surrender to the Chinese, and those to the south would surrender to the British. There was, however, now a delay in the surrender, as MacArthur didn't want the surrender to take place in Indochina until he accepted the main Japanese surrender. This couple of weeks gap meant a delay in the Allied soldiers arriving and also them being released from the Japanese prisoner of war camps. Viet Minh stepped into this gap and tried to take over control of Vietnam, but weren't able to do this completely before the British troops arrived, so there was a period of chaos with rioting and looting taking place. The Allied commander on the ground then, with well-trained and well-equipped British troops, released the British and French prisoners and armed them. Then, combined with the forces of the Japanese, the British and French then attacked the poorly trained, poorly equipped Viet Minh forces, inflicting heavy casualties upon them and securing all of the main urban areas, driving the Viet Minh forces into the countryside. In 1946, the French government, having sorted things out at home, was now prepared to take control of Indochina and shipped out troops from France to take over control from the British in the south and largely nationalist forces in the north. The Chinese had originally wanted to keep control of the north, and there had been an agreement at the Potsdam Conference allowing this, but the nationalist troops were now needed back home, so they returned to the land of French control. On arrival of the French troops, the British commander advised the French to find some kind of negotiated settlement with the Viet Minh, but the French commander was under orders from the French government to suppress all resistance to French rule. In the years that followed, there was some rather inconclusive skirmishes and guerrilla activity as the French military tried to crack down on the rather elusive Viet Minh fighters, and in turn the Viet Minh military forces led by Vio Nguyen Giap tried to recover from their earlier losses. At the same time, train new fighters in the ways of unconventional warfare. All this was to change, however, in 1949, when instead of having nationalist Chinese on the border of the north, the French now had communists. The communists then supplied help to Giap's forces. At the same time, the French, who were starting to tire of the conflict, announced the independence of Vietnam within a greater French Union, and started to form a Vietnamese army to defend it. With this change, in 1950, the Americans were prepared to help out the French with air support in an attempt to stem the advance of communism. As Viet Minh started to become stronger, the French attempted to tempt them out of the countryside to attack established French positions where they believed they could defeat them in detail. This worked in 1952 with the Battle of Nay San, but 2 years later it led to the disaster of Dien Bien Phu, where Giap had learnt all of the lessons from the early mistakes he'd made. As a result of this and growing unpopularity of the war back home in France, there was a negotiated settlement of the conflict in 1954, with the communists taking control of Vietnam north of the 17th parallel, and an independent but Western-leading government to the south. This led to the problems later on, but we'll get to that later.